You are listening to the Businesstalk podcast. I am Deepak, your host from India. It's a great honor to have Dr. Jérôme Barthélemy joins us as our esteemed guest on today's episode. Dr. Jérôme Barthélemy is a professor of strategy and management at ESSEC Business School, where he previously served as an executive vice president and dean for post-experience programs, and corporate relations. Holding a PhD from HEC Paris, Professor Javoy has been a visiting professor and research scholar at leading global institutions including École Polytechnique, Stanford University, New York University, and the University of Cambridge. His research has been published in top-tier academic journals such as Strategic Management Journal, Journal of Business Venturing, and Journal of Management Studies, as well as in leading practitioner publications like Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review. He is the author of Myths of Strategy, a widely acclaimed book that challenges common misconceptions in the field of strategy. His earlier book, Unleash Your Company's Competitive Spirit, was honored with France's Best Management Book Award. Joins us as Dr. Jérôme Barthélemy unpacks the core idea from his book, Myths of Strategy, separating fact from fiction to show how real strategic success is achieved. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jérôme Barthélemy to the podcast. Professor Javoy, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you, Deepak. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Professor, many leaders believe that adopting the latest technology is automatically a performance booster. How do you distinguish between technology that truly creates strategic value and technology that is just a costly distraction?
Yes, first thing, you do not need to use the latest technology to innovate. Sometimes an old one will also do the trick. One of my favorite stories is that of the rolling suitcase. Rolling suitcase was invented in the 1970s by some guy named Bernard Sado. He was coming back from his holiday, waiting at the airport, when he just saw someone pushing a trolley with a very heavy machine on it. Then he just thought, wow, what if we put some wheels to the suitcases? And that was the invention of the suitcase. That was the 1970s. Keep in mind that the wheel was invented in 3500 before Christ. So basically, you can innovate with very old technology. But let's be more serious. There are only two questions to ask when you think about a technology. First, will using this technology enable you to decrease your costs? Second, will it increase what is called the willingness to pay, which means the value you create for the customer? These are the two basic strategic questions, but that's the way to think. It's about cost, it's about perceived value for the customer. If the technology doesn't decrease cost or create more value for the customer, just forget it.
Professor, one of the common slogans in business is that you must think outside the box to innovate. From your research, when is thinking inside the box actually more effective for innovation than radical, out-of-box ideas?
As starting from a blank page is very stressful. And you know what? The best entrepreneurs, what they often do is combine existing ideas to come up with new businesses. That's quite an old concept. Maybe you may know that Picasso, for instance, what made him so successful? He found his style with a painting that is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, very famous. Where did the idea come from for this painting? At the time, Picasso was a fan of Henri Matisse, a very famous French painter. He had just painted La Joie de Vivre, a famous painting. And Picasso went to a dinner with Matisse one day, and Matisse came to the dinner with an African sculpture. So that was quite unexpected. But Picasso, during the entire dinner, looked at him. Then he came back to his home and it started painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which, if you know the country, blend what Matisse did and also this kind of angular structure that comes from the African sculpture. So basically, it can be very stressful to say to people, you must innovate, you must come up with new idea, think out of the box. There is nothing really new under the sun. Most of the most creative ideas come from recombining existing stuff. That's as easy as it seems.
Professor, there is a growing trend of appointing chief strategy officers with the assumption that having one guarantees better strategy and execution. What misconceptions do you see around this role? And what actually determines whether a chief strategy officer adds real value?
There is actually some academic research on this topic. And what does this research show? First, we can explain why companies hire chief strategy officers. There are three main factors. It depends on how diversified they are. Second, on how many merger and acquisitions they make, and also on what is called the power centralization, whether the company is centralized or not. So it's quite easy to explain why companies hire CSOs. What was a bit more distressing in all this research is that the results show that hiring CSOs has absolutely no impact on performance whatsoever. So it's not negative, but it's not positive. So the question is why? There are actually two explanations. The first one is that, well, not every CSO is so great. So that's the first one. The second one is maybe more important. Most of the time, CSOs don't have so much power in the company. So even if they're great, they cannot really influence the economic and also stock market performance of companies.
Professor, you argue that there are no magic recipes for business success. If there were, every company would follow them and none would stand out. How should leaders think about strategy in a world that desperately wants simple formulas and best practices?
So I'm really sorry, Deepak. There is no silver bullet. Basically, what is a strategy? The best definition I know for strategy is an educated guess. You can use many tools, you can think a lot, but at some point, it's a bet. Developing strategy is not so complex. Basically, it's answering three major questions. Is who should we target as a client? What product or service should we develop for them? And how should we organize? So these are the three basic questions. It's very well known. But the real issue is that when you are making these decisions, you can never be fully sure that you are making the right decisions. If you are sure, you are making what is called an operational decision. Should we cut costs? Should we cut costs? Of course. Should we maybe do more AI? Of course. Should we be more responsible? That's also the case. But strategy is making these decisions not the same as our competitors. That's stressful because you only know after the fact if you made the right ones.
Professor, you describe business strategy as a messy, hard work, and difficult to get it right. Can you walk us through a concrete example where this messiness was actually essential to arriving a strong and effective strategy?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of all time, European, is so-called Nespresso. Nespresso is a high-end coffee. These products took years to become successful. So it never really took off. At the time, the decision that had been made by the leaders of Nestlé, a Swiss company, was to focus on companies, cafes, hotel, restaurants, and make machines and pods. Didn't take off. Then comes this guy, French guy, of course, called Jean-Paul Gaillard. He immediately says, we should not target companies, café, hotels, they already have machines. We should not do machines, let's outsource, we focus on the pods. He goes to the CEO of Nestlé, said this should be the new strategy, focusing on high income households, focusing on the pods. The answer from the CEO is no way. No one will buy coffee that's so expensive. But he insists like crazy. In the end, he gives it a try, doesn't work so well, but he said at the time, my gut told me that he could succeed. So he insists, and eventually it became a success. But actually, no one at Nestle believed it could work out. It worked out in the end. So basically, strategy is messy because someone at some point has to put a stake on the ground, go for something, while not everyone is convinced. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it's the only way to be really successful.
Professor, the strategy world is full of management consultants and business gurus. making sweeping generalizations. What are some of the most dangerous or misleading universal truths about strategy that you encounter, and why do they persist?
Biggest myth, in my opinion, is that you should look at the best for inspiration. Let me give you an example. Look at the most successful business people. You usually see two things. They had an idea and they never gave up. They never surrendered, even when there was difficulty, adversity. Second thing, they always managed to convince people to follow them. Employees, maybe people that finance them. So basically, what you could get out of seeing these people is that if you want to be successful, you must be perseverant, you must persevere, and you must have some kind of skill for persuading people to follow you. The issue is that if you look at the worst business people, the people that failed greatly, they're the exact same thing. They had an idea, but they persevered. They had an idea, they managed to convince everyone to follow them, and everyone was ruined. So basically, there is a kind of mistake that you see in many management books, strategy books. You look at successful companies, you look at what they're doing, and then you say to people, if you do this, you'll be successful. That's totally stupid or even crazy, because what can you learn if you only look at successful companies or people? To learn the lessons from success, you should compare them. You should compare winners and losers. If you only look at winners, you won't learn anything. So that's the greatest myth. If you want to be successful, look at successful people or companies.
Professor, your book debunks 30 of the most common strategy myths. If you had to choose one myth that causes the most damage in organizations, which one would it be, and what should companies do instead?
Yeah, one of the greatest strategy myths is that when you are in a recession or crisis, you should cut costs. At first glance, makes a lot of sense. Of course, if you cut costs, you will be able to make up for the loss of some revenue. So that seems to make sense. But actually, what research shows is that when there is a recession, the companies that manage to come out of the recession stronger than before, they did the exact opposite. Basically, they invested in R&D, in marketing. Why does that work? Because in a recession, fewer companies will invest in marketing. So with limited money, you can really stand out. Same for R&D. Fewer companies invest in R&D. If you keep doing so, when the recession eventually is finished, you will get out of the recession stronger as before. So basically, when there is a recession, some companies need to cut costs, otherwise they go bankrupt. But most companies, they should cut costs, but also invest in some parts of their activity, because this can really give them a competitive advantage when the recession will eventually stop. Sorry.
Professor, you emphasize tried and tested business ideas over fashionable concepts. How can executives tell the difference between a genuinely robust strategic principle and a passing fad wrapped in a clever jargon?
It's basically, if you want to spot a management fad or a management fashion, there are 5 elements you may want to have a look at. Fads usually, they are based on very simple ideas. It must be very simple, something very straightforward. Second thing, these fads, they overpromise. They would say, if you use these, you'll be successful. Third, they claim that they are universally relevant, which means that any company can use it. Fourth, they can be very easily implemented. Anyone could use it, and it could be easy to implement. The last element is they are often illustrated by a few case studies, maybe a successful book, not like mine. I mean, not the myth of strategy, but some book that promotes a fad. And when you have these 5 characteristics, what will happen is that many companies will adopt this management fad, but a few months, a few years later, it will disappear. Because what is interesting, what makes the fad so successful, it's simple, it overpromises, it seems to be easy to do. The fad never delivers on what it promises. So it disappears quite quickly. So again, strategy, management in general, there is no silver bullet. It takes a lot of work to implement, but there is no recipe that you can use and be more successful than others.
Professor, the Business Myth series aims to overturn out-of-date assumptions and skewer stereotypes across leadership, management, and strategy. How does myths of strategy fit into this broader mission? And what mindset shift do you hope readers take back to their organizations?
Yes, unfortunately, I think that critical thinking is not developed enough in the business world. Most leaders, managers are very, very clever, but as soon as they come in companies, they stop being critical enough. To some extent, that's understandable. You do not want to be cynical, of course, but still, it's bad for companies. The best example I know to illustrate this, very French example. A few years ago, two French students came up with a fake management technique. Okay, they invented it, and then they sent a survey explaining that this was a new management tool, that it had been published in a Harvard Business Review press book, and it had been used by many companies. And one of the authors even started his consulting company to promote this new tool. It was totally invented. They sent the questionnaire to people and they got the answers. And what came out of the survey, independent consultant, they all liked it. They say, oh, it's something new, because they're always looking for something new for their clients. Consultants from big companies like major consulting firms, they hated it because they only like the tools they invent themselves. Professors, they also hated the tool because they say, oh, it's too similar to this tool from 10 years ago, so they knew the entire history. But what's more interesting, managers also seem to like it. They never question whether it was fake or not. They just try to look at examples from their own experience that could illustrate the tool. That was a typically, I'm not sure it was so ethical study done by these students, but it shows that in companies, people are often maybe they take things for granted. They should be maybe more critical or use more critical thinking.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For a listener who is not a strategy expert but want to make a better decision in their business, what is one practical way to start questioning the myths they hear every day and build a more realistic, evidence-based view of strategy?
There is no recipe here. As I just said before, be critical of what's going on around you, but not cynical. Because you can only succeed if you think a little differently from others. That's tough, that's somewhat stressful, but that's the only way to stand out. If you want to get some new ideas, you should read as much as you can, and not only what you find on social networks, but there is no silver bullet. I think if you really want to be successful, you need to have a broad culture, know a lot of things, to be able to make connections between things that are currently not connected. That ties back to something I just said a few minutes ago. To be successful, you need to think differently, but it's simpler than it seems, because thinking differently often means recombining things that already exist, but that have not been recombined. It's as easy, requires some mental energy, but it's still doable.
Thank you very much, Professor Jevoy, for sharing your invaluable insights and taking the time to be with us today. Your clear evidence-based perspective on strategy has given us a lot to reflect on and apply in our own work. We truly appreciate your generously in answering our questions and challenging some of our assumptions along the way. It has been a truly privilege to learn from you, and we hope to have the opportunity to engage with your work again in the future. Thank you so much.
And thanks a lot for the invitation, Deepak.